She gave him everything, her loyalty, her blood, her unborn child. And the moment another woman whispered poison in his ear, he believed the lie without blinking. No trial, no mercy, just chains and cold stone and the sound of a sacred bond being ripped from her chest like a blade pulled slow. This is the story of a woman who was destroyed by the one man sworn to protect her, and what she became after the fire went out. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching this from. The torches were burning low in the great hall of Vordenmar when Luna Evelina first heard the accusation that would end her life as she knew it. She had been standing at the far end of the throne room, her back straight, her hands folded at her waist the way the court expected. Composed, regal, invisible in her composure. 8 months of carrying the air of the Vordenmar bloodline had thickened her frame and slowed her step, but she had never once let the court see her struggle. That was the first law she had learned after Kaelor took her as his mate. Weakness was a wound you showed your enemies before they even drew a sword. The hall was packed. Every high-ranking noble, every general, every advisor who served King Alpha Kaelor Vordenmar had been summoned before the evening meal. Evelina had assumed it was another council on the eastern skirmishes. She had not been invited to those meetings in months, not since Kaelor's mistress, Soraya, had begun attending them in her place. But the guards had come to her chambers with a royal summons bearing the king's black seal, and Evelina had dressed herself without her handmaids, braided her dark hair back from her face, and walked the long corridor to the throne room with her chin level and her pulse steady. She had been wrong about the skirmishes. Soraya stood at the center of the hall in a gown the color of dried blood, her pale hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen in a performance so practiced it could have drawn applause. 3 of her personal attendants stood behind her, heads bowed, as if they were witnesses to a tragedy. Kaelor sat on the obsidian throne above them all, and the expression on his face, the stillness of it, the cold calculation behind those amber eyes Evelina had once believed held tenderness, told her everything before a single word was spoken. He already believed whatever Soraya had told him. The realization hit Evelina not like a blow, but like water through a cracked wall. Slow at first, then flooding, then everywhere at once. Luna Evelina, the herald's voice carried through the hall, formal and deliberate. You are called to stand before your king and answer for what has been witnessed this day. She walked forward because there was nothing else to do. The crowd parted. She could feel their eyes moving across her, measuring, judging, some with pity and some with a hunger that told her they had already decided the verdict for themselves. She stopped 10 feet from Soraya and met the woman's gaze without flinching. Soraya did not smile. She had learned long ago that smiling in these moments made the cruelty too obvious. Instead, she let a single tear trace down her cheek and turned her face up toward Kaelor like a woman in genuine grief. Tell him, Soraya said softly to her attendants. Tell him what you saw. The eldest of the 3 stepped forward. Her voice was practiced and flat, the cadence of someone reciting memorized lines. She spoke of a tonic prepared in secret. She spoke of a midwife dismissed from Evelina's chambers 3 nights prior. She spoke of bleeding that Soraya had discovered when she went to Evelina's rooms to speak about the upcoming naming ceremony. Evelina stood very still. She had learned this too, how to keep the body quiet when the mind was screaming. She let the woman speak. She cataloged each lie with the cold precision of someone building a case, because she was going to need every detail when she answered. When the attendant finished, the hall fell silent except for the torches and the distant wind pressing against the high windows. She's lying, Evelina said. Her voice was flat. Not angry. Flat, which was worse, and she knew it. Every word of that account is fabricated. I dismissed Mira from my chambers because she had been reporting my private conversations to Soraya's household. I have records. My handmaid Lena was present. As for the tonic, there was blood on the floor of your chambers. Kaelor's voice cut across hers like an axe. Evelina turned to face him fully. She had not looked at him when she walked in. She had been cataloging the room, the crowd, the angle of Soraya's performance. Now she looked. He was wearing his war crown, the narrow iron circle he put on only when he intended to deliver judgment. She had seen him wear it twice before, both times over men who had committed treason against the throne. Something cold moved through her chest. Not fear exactly, Something worse, the beginning of understanding. There was blood, she said carefully, because I had a fall 3 days ago in the eastern courtyard. I told you about it. You were there, Kaylor. You helped me to my feet yourself. The flicker across his face was fast, but she caught it. He remembered. Of course he remembered. But the memory was not enough, or it was inconvenient, or Soraya had already spent weeks building a story that made the fall itself part of the lie. She watched him choose the story over the truth in real time and felt something inside her begin to break along lines she had not known were there. You fell. His voice was neutral, judicial. Or you made it appear that way. Kaylor. She said his name quietly, just his name, without title, the way she had always said it when they were alone and the walls between them came down. A last attempt. A reaching across the space that had grown between them over these months without her fully understanding how wide it had become. His jaw tightened. He looked away from her and toward Soraya. The child is gone, Soraya said softly, pressing a hand to her own flat abdomen in an obscene pantomime of grief. Your heir, my king, gone because she could not bear to carry the future of a bloodline not her own. The hall erupted. Not in screams, in the controlled, vicious murmuring of a court that had already chosen sides and was now settling into the satisfaction of public confirmation. Evelina stood in the center of it and pressed one hand against her abdomen where the child moved, alive, unhurt, still there. And she understood with the clarity of a woman who has been watching a trap close around her for months that it didn't matter. The child's heartbeat against her palm didn't matter. Her own testimony didn't matter. The records and the witnesses and the fall in the eastern courtyard didn't matter. What mattered was the amber in Kaylor's eyes and the iron circle on his brow and the fact that he had already decided. Bring the chains, he said. The two words fell through the hall like stones into deep water. Kaylor. This time she did not say his name softly. You are making a mistake. You will be silent. He stood, and the hall went silent with him. 7 feet of muscle and pride and divine authority rising from the obsidian throne, filling the room the way he always did, like a storm given the shape of a man. You will be silent, and you will answer for what you have done to my bloodline. I have done nothing to your bloodline. She took a step toward him. The guards at her side shifted, hands moving to hilts. She ignored them. The child is alive, Kaylor. Feel the bond. You can still feel it. Put your hand on me and feel it. Something crossed his face. A crack, a hesitation. The ghost of the man she had stood beside through 3 years of war and alliance and bleeding, terrible love. She saw it. She was certain she saw it. And then Soraya made a small, broken sound. Not quite a sob, more delicate than that, carefully calibrated. And Kaylor's face closed like a fist. The bond, he said, is something I should have ended months ago. Evelina had thought she was prepared. She had been building herself up for this walk down from the eastern courtyard 3 days ago when she first realized what Soraya was doing. She had told herself, if it comes, you will survive it. You have survived everything else. The border wars and the winter campaigns and the 3 miscarriages before this pregnancy that held, you survived all of it. This is just another wound. She had been wrong about what the bond severance felt like. It was not like a sword wound. It was not sharp and clean and survivable with pressure and time. It was the extraction of something that did not have edges, something that had threaded through her so completely she had stopped knowing where it ended and she began. When Kaylor raised his hand and invoked the ancient rite, when she felt the severing begin, it moved through her like cold fire from the inside out, consuming nerve and marrow and something beneath both. Something that did not have a name in any language but that had always been there. The deep animal recognition of a mate. The part of her that had known him before she knew anything else about him. The scream that came out of her was not grief. It was not rage. It was just sound, raw and involuntary, the way a body makes sound when something vital is being removed without mercy. She heard the court react. She heard Soraya's carefully composed silence. She felt her knees hit the stone floor and did not remember deciding to kneel. When it was done, the emptiness was so vast it felt structural, like something had been removed from the architecture of her body, and now the walls were bearing weight wrong. Take her to the lower cells, Kaylor said. She let them put the chains on her because her hands had stopped working properly. The iron was cold. Someone had cut her braid away from her face at some point. She did not remember when. The torchlight moved strangely across the stone floor as they walked her toward the iron door at the back of the hall, and she watched it move and tried to locate herself inside the emptiness and found nothing. Behind her, she heard Soraya speak to Kalor in a low voice. She could not make out the words. She heard his answer, 2 syllables, quiet, final. The iron door opened. The stairs went down. She stopped counting steps around the 32nd one. The lower cells of Vordenmar had been built before the kingdom had a name. The stone was so old it had turned dark and smooth, worn down by centuries of condensation and the pressed hands of prisoners who had stood against these walls before her. The torches down here were cheap, tallow, not wax, and they smoked and guttered and threw shadows that moved like living things across the ceiling. The guard who locked her cell was young. She noticed that, barely past 20, his jaw still soft under the stubble, his hands moving quickly over the lock in a way that told her he did not want to look at her face. She understood that too. Looking at the Luna in chains required a decision about what kind of man you were going to be, and most men in a king's court had already made that decision long before a moment like this forced them to examine it. "Your name," she said. He startled. "My... what?" "Your name." Her voice was calm. The calmness surprised her. Something in the emptiness left behind by the bond severance had settled into something almost like clarity, cold and vast and very, very quiet. "Tell me your name. Someone should know it." He swallowed. "Fen," he said. "Fen Caldrew." "Thank you, Fen Caldrew." She sat down on the stone ledge that served as a bed, settled her chained hands in her lap, and looked at the opposite wall. "Go home to whoever's waiting for you." He left. The sound of his boots on the stairs faded. The cell was quiet except for the tallow torch, and from somewhere deeper in the corridor, the slow drip of water finding its way through stone that had stopped trying to hold it back 300 years ago. Evelina put her hand on her abdomen. The child moved. A slow, rolling push against her palm, like a fist uncurling in sleep, like something completely unaware of the iron and the cold and the severed bond and the silence where a father's awareness had been. She held her hand there and breathed and told herself the same thing she had been telling herself since the eastern courtyard 3 days ago. Survive first. Everything else comes after. She did not know that night in the lower cells that she was already dying slowly. The bond severance in a mate pregnancy was not something the court scholars discussed openly. It was in the old texts, the ones kept in the restricted archive, that Soraya's cousin happened to oversee. The shock of it could stop the child's development within weeks. The body, without the connective thread of the mate bond to anchor the pregnancy, began to work against itself. Most Lunas in her condition did not last 30 days. She did not know this yet. What she knew was the cold and the dark and the unbroken sound of water finding its way through places it was not supposed to be. Weeks moved the way time moves in places without light, not in days, but in the accumulation of small things. The changing of the guard, the twice-daily delivery of water and bread that grew harder and smaller as the weeks passed, as if whoever was managing the provisions expected her to take up less space in the world as time went on. The temperature dropping by degrees so gradual she did not notice until she woke one morning shaking so badly she could not hold the water cup steady. The child moved less frequently. She told herself it was normal. She had been told by the midwives that the 8th month brought a slowing of movement as the body prepared. She held on to this. She pressed her hands to her abdomen in the dark and counted the intervals between movements and held on to the count like a rope in deep water. The woman in the adjacent cell had been there longer. Evelina heard her for the first days before they spoke. Shuffling, breathing, the occasional low sound that was not quite a cough and not quite a word. Then one night, when the corridor was particularly cold and particularly quiet, the woman spoke through the gap in the stones. "You're the Luna." Not a question. The voice was old, not frail, old the way iron goes old, dense and difficult and still bearing weight. "Was," Evelina said. A silence. "Was implies it's over, isn't it? Nothing's over while you're still breathing. That's the only rule that holds." Evelina did not answer. She pressed her hands flat against the stone beside her and felt the cold of it moving up through her wrists, and thought about Kalor in the great hall with his iron crown and his already decided eyes, and tried to locate anger and found, mostly, exhaustion. "Your child," the old woman said. "Is it still moving?" "Less." The word came out before Evelina decided to say it. A long silence, the drip of water, the settle of old stone. "I need to examine you," the woman said. "There's a gap in the lower wall between the cells. The guards don't know about it. Big enough to pass my hands through." "I don't know you." "No. But you're going to let me anyway, because whatever you're telling yourself about the slowing movement, you know it isn't normal. You know what a body feels like when it's still fighting, and you know what it feels like when it starts to stop." The silence between them stretched out until it wasn't silence anymore, just Evelina deciding. "Show me the gap," she said. The old woman's name was Tessara. She had been a healer once, a real one, trained in the old practice before the court physicians had consolidated their authority and driven the independent healers out of the capital cities. She had been imprisoned 8 months ago for practicing without a court license, which was the official reason, and for healing a child belonging to a family that had defied the king's taxation, which was the real one. She had the hands of someone who had worked with them for 60 years, rough-palmed, sure-fingered, reading a body the way someone else reads a map. She passed her hands through the gap in the lower stone, and Evelina let her work in the dark, guided by touch and the sound of Tessara's low, steady instructions. "Breathe here, hold here. Tell me when you feel this." When it was done, Tessara withdrew her hands and said nothing for a long time. "Tell me," Evelina said. "The bond severance in a pregnancy this advanced—" Tessara stopped, started again. "It works on the body like a slow poison. Your system is fighting itself. Without the mate anchor, the pregnancy is trying to complete on momentum alone, and it's not enough." "How long?" "Honestly? If nothing changes, 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if you're strong." Evelina sat with this. The tallow torch guttered. The child moved, one small, weak movement, and then nothing. "What changes it?" she said. "I don't know enough yet. There's something in your blood I've never encountered before. Something that shouldn't be there, or shouldn't be possible. I can't tell which yet." Tessara's voice had changed. The flatness in it had cracked open slightly, like a stone with a fault line showing. "I need more time. I need to examine you properly, not through a gap in the wall, and I need you to keep eating whatever they bring you, even when it tastes like the floor." "I've been eating it." "Good. Keep surviving. It's the only thing I can tell you with certainty right now. Survival is the work, and there isn't any other work." Evelina lay back on the stone ledge in the dark and put her hands on her abdomen and listened to the water finding its way through the stone and tried to remember the last time she had eaten anything hot. She could not. She tried to remember Kalor's face before the Iron Crown, the face she had known in the early years, tired and rough, and occasionally, rarely, soft in the way that large, dangerous things are soft only when they believe no one is watching. She had spent 3 years believing that softness was the truth of him and the hardness was the performance. She understood now that she had it exactly backward. The rebellion came without warning, the way the real ones always do. Evelina had been in the cells for 31 days when the sound reached her. Not through the walls, but through the floor, vibration before noise, the deep structural tremble of something catastrophic happening above. Then the distant sound of shouting, then something that might have been cannon fire, or might have been the main gate coming down. Then nothing, then everything at once. The guard rotation stopped. This was the first sign. The twice-daily delivery did not come. The torches in the corridor began to die one by one as no one came to replace them. And the darkness in the lower cells became the kind that pressed against the eyes with physical weight. Tessara's voice came through the gap in the stone, low and even. "Stay quiet. Whatever's happening above, we wait." "We wait," Evelina agreed. They waited through what felt like a full day. The sounds above rose and fell and rose again. At some point, fire reached somewhere in the upper levels, and the smoke came down. Not enough to kill, but enough to coat the lungs and make the darkness feel thinner and more hostile. Evelina sat with her back against the wall and her hands on her abdomen and counted movements and did not let herself calculate the interval. When the cell door opened, it was not a guard. It was a young woman, 16, maybe 17, in the rough clothes of a kitchen worker, holding a torch in one hand and a key ring in the other, her face streaked with ash and something dark that Evelina did not examine closely. She had the look of someone who had stepped through a door into a version of the world she had not fully agreed to enter but was not going to step back from either. Luna Evelina. She held out the torch. There are people outside the wall who are asking for you by name. They said to say the moon doesn't die in the dark. Evelina stood. Her legs were uncertain. 31 days of cold stone and reduced rations had done their work. But she stood, and she straightened, and she looked at the girl clearly. My neighbor, she said, the healer in the next cell. She comes with me. The girl glanced at the adjacent cell door. Something moved across her face. They said just you. She comes with me, Evelina said, not loudly, not as a request. The girl found the right key. Tessara emerged from her cell, looking exactly as Evelina had imagined her. Small, iron-spined, with white hair cut close to her skull, and eyes the color of storm water. She assessed Evelina in one sweeping look, glanced at the girl with the torch, and said nothing. Just moved to Evelina's side, close enough to provide support without making it obvious, and they followed the girl up through the dying fortress. The rebellion had gutted the lower levels. Evelina walked through corridors she had walked 100 times as Luna and saw them differently now. The tapestries pulled down, the gold fixtures stripped, the portraits of Kylor's bloodline lying face down on the stone floors where they had been thrown or fallen. She stepped over one and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief, just the flat, cold nothing of a woman who has already used up everything she had on surviving and does not have the surplus for symbolism. The eastern courtyard, the same courtyard where she had fallen 34 days ago, where Kaylor had helped her to her feet with his hands warm on her arms, and she had believed then that the warmth meant something, was a different world now. Half of it was on fire. Groups of fighters moved through the smoke. The sound was immense and disorienting, and Evelina stood at the threshold and breathed through her mouth and located north by instinct. This way, Tessara said. You know where we're going. I know where the people who use that phrase come from. Tessara began moving, not toward the main gate, where the fighting was densest, but toward the servant entrance in the northeastern wall, half hidden behind a collapsed section of outer battlement. Keep moving and keep quiet, and let your body do what it remembers how to do. They moved through the smoke and the chaos and the dying orange light of a kingdom that was burning itself from the inside out. And nobody stopped them, because in the middle of a rebellion, a pregnant woman and an old healer are furniture. They are scenery. They are not the point of anybody's story, and Evelina understood with cold clarity that this invisibility, the same invisibility that had let Soraya build her trap piece by piece for months without anyone looking directly at it, was the only thing keeping them alive right now, and she used it without apology. The servant entrance was broken open. Beyond it, the city's outer ring. Beyond that, darkness and the smell of cold. Don't stop, Tessara said. They did not stop. 2 hours outside the walls, in a stand of black-trunked winter trees where the snow had been trampled by the passage of many feet, 3 figures waited. One held horses. One held a lantern. The third stepped forward when Evelina emerged from the tree line and she saw the phrase had been literal. The cloth at his shoulder bore an embroidered crescent, faded with age, the symbol of something old enough that she had only seen it in archive drawings. She did not ask questions. She filed it, survival first. We need to move north immediately, the man said. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, not reverence exactly, more the look of someone confronting the confirmation of something they had been told their whole lives and had half believed and half feared was true. Can you ride? I can ride, she said. He glanced at her abdomen, then at Tessara, then back at Evelina. The northern route is hard in winter. You understand what we're... I understand, she said. Give me a horse. He gave her a horse. They rode north as the first snow of the season began to fall. And behind her, somewhere in the burning castle she had called home for 3 years, Kaylor was discovering what she had known for 31 days. That the mistress he had trusted over his mate had played him like a man who wanted to be played, and the woman he had put in chains had never betrayed him at all. She did not think about him. She thought about the child and the cold and the distance to whatever was waiting in the north. She thought about Tessara's words through the gap in the stone. Something in your blood I've never encountered before. Something that shouldn't be possible. And she held that fragment and turned it over in her mind the way you hold something you're not sure is a weapon yet. The snow fell harder, the trees thinned. The world ahead opened into the vast pale emptiness of the northern wastelands, where the wind came straight off the ice fields and the cold was a living thing with intent. Evelina rode into it without looking back, and then, without warning, her horse stopped, not spooked. Stopped, planted, refusing, the specific behavior of an animal that has perceived something ahead that the human on its back has not yet registered. The others pulled up behind her. The man with the crescent badge drew his weapon. Tessara moved her horse alongside Evelina's in silence. Out of the snow and the darkness ahead came the sound of a single set of hoofbeats, moving slowly, deliberately, the pace of something that was not trying to avoid being heard. The figure that emerged from the white was enormous, mounted on a black horse that stood a full hand taller than any Evelina had seen, wearing armor that bore no kingdom's markings, carrying no torch, needing none. He stopped 40 feet away and looked at her through the snowfall with eyes that caught the dim moonlight and did not release it. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, the way you look at something you have been searching for long enough that finding it requires a moment to believe. The man with the crescent badge made a sound, low, somewhere between recognition and fear. "Who is he?" Evelina said. Her voice was completely flat. The man's answer came back so quietly she almost missed it under the wind. "Riker Volgrim," he said, "Supreme Alpha of the North." The black horse took one step forward through the snow, and Riker Volgrim looked at Evelina Vordenmar. Looked at her with the assessing directness of a man who does not waste time on performance, and said 4 words that she would not understand until much later. "I've been waiting longer than you know." The words landed in the snowfield between them and did not dissolve the way words in cold air usually do. They held their shape. They pressed. Evelina looked at Riker Volgrim across 40 feet of trampled snow and felt nothing she had a name for. The emptiness where the bond had been was still the dominant fact of her interior world, vast and structural and indifferent to everything happening outside her body. She catalogued him the way she had learned to catalog threats in the years before she became a Luna, back when she was still just a border lord's daughter, learning that the world was divided not into good and bad, but into those who moved first and those who absorbed the consequences. He was not moving. That was the first thing. He sat on the black horse with the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that movement was a form of asking, and he did not ask for anything. He simply occupied the space in front of her the way weather occupies space, completely, without apology, without the performance of presence that lesser men needed to feel real. "You've been waiting," she said, "for me specifically, or for whoever came out of that prison. You specifically." No hesitation. "You know who I am. I know what you carry." He glanced at her abdomen, not with the assessing judgment of the court physicians or the barely concealed contempt of Kaelor's generals, but with the directness of someone reading a situation in full. "And I know what Vordenmar just did to the mother of his heir." "Former heir," she said, "the bond is severed." Something moved in his eyes. Not pity. She would have turned the horse around if it had been pity. It was something harder than that. The recognition of a specific kind of damage, the kind that comes not from a single blow, but from a slow, sustained pressure that the person absorbing it keeps mistaking for love until the structure fails. "The bond being severed doesn't change the blood," he said. "And the blood is why I'm here." Behind her, the man with the crescent badge had gone very quiet. She could feel him trying not to exist, which told her more about Riker Volgrim's reputation than anything else could have. "You're going to explain that," she said. "I'm going to explain it somewhere that isn't an open field in the beginning of a northern winter." He turned the black horse without ceremony and looked back at her once. "Keep up or don't. But the storm behind you is going to be worse than the one ahead." She looked back. The glow on the southern horizon was Vordenmar burning. Kaelor's fortress, 3 years of her life, the court that had watched her walk out in chains, all of it turning itself to ash without her help, without her presence, without needing anything from her at all. The sight should have felt like something. It mostly felt like weather. She turned north and followed Riker Volgrim into the dark. The fortress of Grimvast appeared out of the storm the way mountains appear. Suddenly, after a long period of suspecting they were there, it was not beautiful. It was not meant to be. The stone was the same color as the ice around it, and the walls were thick enough that the wind that had been trying to kill them for the last 4 hours simply stopped at the outer gate, cut off mid-howl like a sound swallowed by a closing fist. Evelina rode through the gate and felt the silence of the inner yard close around her and breathed for what felt like the first time since the lower cells. Riker dismounted without waiting for help and tossed his reins to a groom who appeared from nowhere with the particular efficiency of a staff that had learned to move before being asked. He looked at Evelina still on her horse. "Can you get down?" he said. Not unkindly, just directly. Yes. She got down. Her legs held. Barely. Tessara appeared at her side. Tessara, who had ridden the whole 4 hours in silence, observing everything with those storm water eyes, spending none of herself on reaction. She took Evelina's arm without making it look like support, and they followed Riker through the inner door into the main hall of Grimvast. The hall was nothing like Vorden Mar's throne room. No tapestries, no gold, no obsidian for the spectacle of power. Just stone and fire. Massive hearths burning at both ends, a table long enough for 30 men set with food that was simple and hot, maps pinned to the walls with iron stakes, and at least a dozen people in the room who looked up when Riker entered and went back to what they were doing without ceremony. Nobody bowed. Nobody announced him. This alone told Evelina more about the man than any report she had ever received. "Eat," Riker said, gesturing toward the table. "We talk after. We talk now." She stopped walking. Tessara's hand tightened slightly on her arm. "You said you've been waiting for me specifically. You said it's about the blood. I've been in a cell for 31 days, and I watched my mate Bond get cut out of me in front of a court that had already decided my verdict, and I am not going to sit down at your table and eat your food until I understand what I walked into." The room had gone quiet. Not the aggressive quiet of Vorden Mar's court, the attentive quiet of people who were used to their leader being challenged and were interested in how he handled it. Riker turned to face her fully. In the firelight, his face was all hard angles and old decisions, the kind of face that did not carry anything it had not earned. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair at the head of the table and sat in it himself, crossed his arms and said, "Sit. Not because I told you to, because you're 8 months pregnant and you've been riding 4 hours through a storm on 30 days of prison rations, and if you collapse now, we lose an hour to recovery. That's the practical argument. Make your own choice." She sat. Not because of the argument, because the practical argument was the right language. No appeal to emotion, no performance of concern, just the math of the situation laid out without decoration. She had not heard anyone speak to her that way in 3 years. She had not realized how much she had missed it. Tessara sat beside her and immediately began building a plate without asking permission or looking at anyone. Riker waited until Evelina had eaten enough that the specific hollow edge behind her eyes began to soften. Then he reached inside his armor and set something on the table between them. It was a small disc of dark metal, no larger than a coin, engraved with a pattern so worn it was barely visible, a crescent inside a ring. The same symbol the man in the woods had worn on his shoulder. "The Moon Dynasty," Tessara said, quietly, not surprised, the voice of someone confirming. "The last direct heir of the Moon Dynasty died 230 years ago," Evelina said. "Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows what the court histories say," Riker said. "The court histories were written by the people who hunted the dynasty down." Silence. The fire cracked. Someone at the far end of the hall quietly moved away from the table to give them space. "You're going to tell me I'm descended from a bloodline that supposedly doesn't exist," Evelina said. "I'm going to tell you that your blood contains a marker I've had my people searching for across 3 kingdoms for 6 years, that the marker corresponds exactly to what the old texts describe as the royal moon signature, and that the reason Soraya moved against you when she did, the specific timing of it, is because she has a benefactor who knew what you were before you did, and understood that a Luna-carrying moonblood and a royal heir was a threat that needed to be removed before the child was born." Evelina set down the cup in her hands very carefully. Who is the benefactor? A name you'll have when you're in a position to use it. He held her gaze. Right now you're not. She felt the refusal land in her chest and assessed her own reaction to it. The quick heat of it, the instinct to push, to demand, to take the room by the throat the way she had learned to do in 3 years of standing beside a king who took every room he entered. She let the heat pass. She looked at Riker Volgrim and understood that the refusal was not a power play. It was a calculation. He was reading her stability, her capacity to absorb information in this condition, and making a decision based on what would actually serve the situation rather than what would feel like respect. She did not like it. She filed it. The child, she said. Tessara tells me the bond severance is working against the pregnancy. I know. I have a healer here, better equipped than what you've had access to. Tessara stays as the primary. Her voice was flat. Your healer assists. Those are my terms. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. The acknowledgement of a position well taken. Agreed. And I want to understand my own blood before anyone else uses it for their purposes. She held his gaze without heat, without aggression, just the cold directness of a woman who had learned in 31 days that clarity was the only currency she had left. Including you. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that the fire shifted and the shadows moved and the room around them held its breath. Agreed, he said again. She slept for 14 hours in a room that had a door that locked from the inside. The weeks that followed moved differently than the weeks in the cells had. There was still cold and still pain and still the daily negotiation between her body's limitations and what the situation required of her, but there was also fire and food, and Tessara's ongoing examination and the slow, incremental revelation of what her blood actually contained. The Moon Dynasty bloodline, Tessara explained in their daily sessions in the healer's quarters, was not simply a matter of heritage. It carried what the old text called a resonance, an inherited sensitivity to the deeper currents of power that ran between wolf clans, the way rivers ran between territories. Most of it was dormant in carriers until activated by specific conditions: extreme duress, near death, the severance of a mate bond during a pregnancy. The severance didn't just leave you empty, Tessara said one morning, her hands moving through their examination with practiced efficiency. It cracked the door. Whatever was dormant in your blood has been waking up for 3 weeks. I haven't felt anything different. You noticed the storm was going to turn east 4 hours before it did. You knew Riker's second-in-command was going to come into the hall before the door opened. You corrected the map yesterday, and you've never been north of the wastelands. Evelina was quiet. That's not instinct, Tessara said. That's something else. The child was stable. This was the other fact that Tessara reported daily, and Evelina received it each time with the same controlled neutrality she received everything. Outwardly flat, inwardly the specific relief of someone who has been holding a rope in the dark for weeks and feels it hold. Riker left her alone for the first 12 days. Not avoidance, deliberate space. She observed this and filed it the same way she had filed everything about him since the snowfield. He ran the fortress with the efficiency of a man who had been doing it long enough that he did not need to make it visible. He gave orders that were followed not because they were orders, but because they were correct, and the people around him had learned to trust the correctness. He did not explain himself. He did not perform authority. He simply was the most powerful thing in any room he entered, the way certain geological features are simply the most dominant feature of a landscape. Not aggressively, just factually, inescapably. On the 13th day, he came to the healer's quarters while Tessara was reviewing the old texts, and Evelina was sitting at the window watching the northern wind move through the black trees below the outer wall. "Walk with me," he said. She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with his armor off for the first time she had seen, just a heavy wool shirt, dark, no ceremony. He looked bigger and more real this way, less like a strategic asset and more like a man. "Where?" she said. "The Eastern Training Yard. The footing's been cleared. You need to move or the muscle loss from the cells is going to create problems." "You've been watching my condition." "I've been watching everything. So have you." He met her eyes. "Neither of us is going to pretend otherwise. Walk with me." The Eastern Yard was empty at this hour. Swept stone, cold, clear air. The particular silence of a space that existed for work rather than spectacle. Riker did not make small talk. She had already known he wouldn't. They walked the perimeter twice in silence while she relearned what her body could do, testing her legs against the cold and the uneven stone. On the third circuit, she said, "The benefactor, the one who backed Soraya." Still not yet. Why? Because knowing the name without the power to act on it is just weight, and you're carrying enough weight. She stopped walking. He stopped too, turned, looked at her with that direct, unreadable gaze that she had decided was not unreadable at all. She was simply out of practice reading a face that did not need anything from her. "You're making decisions about what I can handle," she said. "I'm making decisions about what's tactically sound." "Those are different things." "Are they?" Not a question, a position. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came through the yard and moved her braid across her shoulder, and she felt the cold of it. And beneath the cold, the strange low hum that had been building in her blood for 2 weeks, the thing Tessara called the resonance, pressing against the inside of her chest like a sound that had not yet found a way out. "You said you've been searching for the moon bloodline for 6 years, she said. "That's not a political project. That's a long game." "Yes." "What do you get from it?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he was going to refuse this one too. Then he said, "The North has been fracturing for 20 years. Clan wars, border disputes, the kind of slow dissolution that doesn't look like collapse until it already is. The Moon Dynasty bloodline is the only thing in the old text that all the clans recognize as a unifying authority, not a king's authority. Older than that, the kind that doesn't come from conquest. It comes from the blood itself. You want to use me to consolidate the North. I want to offer you the North," he said. "There's a difference. One requires your cooperation because it needs your face on the project. The other requires your actual choice." The hum in her blood pressed harder. She breathed through it. "And if I choose no," she said, "then you choose no. You stay here until you're strong enough to go wherever you're going. My people get you there, no conditions." She stared at him. "Why?" "Because you didn't choose any of this." His voice was level, unperformed. "Soraya chose it. Kaylor chose it. The benefactor chose it. You were handed a set of consequences you didn't earn and told to die quietly in a cell. Whatever you decide next should be yours. That's the only way it holds." The yard was very still. Somewhere above the outer wall, a bird moved through the white sky and was gone. Evelina put her hand on her abdomen, where the child lay quiet and steady, and felt the resonance in her blood press against her palm like an answer she hadn't asked for yet, and looked at Riker Volgrim in the cold morning light and understood something about him that she had been circling for 2 weeks. He was the most dangerous man she had ever been in a room with, not because of the armies at his command or the reputation that made border lords go silent when his name was spoken, because he meant exactly what he said, because there was no performance in him at all. And a man with no performance was a man who could not be read by the tools she had spent 3 years sharpening. "I'm not making any decisions about the North while I'm still recovering," she said. "Reasonable. And when I do make them, they're mine. Not yours. Not the old texts. Mine." "Yes." "And you stop making decisions about what I can handle." He held her gaze. Something in his face shifted. Not concession exactly, more the adjustment of a man recalibrating to a situation that had just changed shape. "Tell me when you want information, and I'll give it to you unfiltered. Starting now." She turned and began the 4th circuit of the yard without looking back. "Tell me the name." He fell into step beside her. "Aldrich Vane," he said. "Chancellor of the Eastern Compact. Soraya's patron for 7 years. The man who first identified your bloodline through a genealogy report he commissioned and then suppressed." A pause. "The man who is currently moving 3,000 soldiers toward Vordenmar's eastern border to take advantage of the chaos the rebellion created." Evelina walked. The cold pressed against her face, and the resonance moved through her blood, and somewhere in the deep structure of her, something that had been dormant for 28 years, heard the name of the man who had tried to erase her before she understood what she was, and began slowly to wake all the way up. She did not say anything for a full circuit of the yard. Then she said, "I'm going to need a sword." Riker said nothing, but when she glanced at him, the thing on his face was not a smile and not satisfaction, and not the strategic pleasure of a man whose plan was unfolding correctly. It was something she had not seen directed at her in a very long time. It was respect. That evening, a rider arrived at Grimvast's outer gate, bearing Kylor's black seal, the formal mark of the Vordenmar throne, pressed into red wax that had not yet fully hardened. The rider was one of Kylor's senior generals, gray-haired and stone-faced, and clearly running on no sleep and the specific adrenaline of a man carrying a message he knew was already too late. Riker received the letter at the main table with Evelina standing 6 feet away. He read it. His face showed nothing. He held it out to her. She looked at it without touching it. Summary. Kylor has discovered the full extent of Soraya's manipulation. He has executed her and her 3 attendants. He is formally requesting that Riker Volgrim, he glanced at the letter, return what belongs to the crown of Vordenmar. The fire cracked. The general stood at the far end of the table, trying to exist as little as possible. Evelina looked at the letter in Riker's hand for a long time. Then she looked at the general. Go back to Kylor, she said. Tell him the crown of Vordenmar lost what it owned the night it put it in chains. She turned back toward the corridor without raising her voice, without heat, without anything at all except the particular finality of a door being closed. Tell him I said he should have investigated. She walked away from the table and did not look back. Behind her, she heard Riker tell the general to eat before he rode south. She heard the general accept. She heard Riker's footsteps behind her, not following, just moving through the hall in the same direction, parallel, unhurried. She stopped at the corridor entrance, did not turn around. He'll come, she said. Kylor. Eventually he'll come himself. I know. Riker's voice was level. What will you do? A pause. Not long. Whatever you tell me to. She stood at the entrance to the corridor with the firelight at her back and the cold stone passage ahead and felt the resonance moving through her blood like a tide, finding its level, like something ancient and patient and enormously powerful, remembering that it had been here long before any of them and would be here long after. She walked forward into the corridor. The door at the end of it opened into the north wing of the fortress, and the north wing faced the open wastelands, and beyond the wastelands, the ice fields began. And beyond the ice fields, the territories of 17 wolf clans waited, fractured, warring, hungry for something to hold. She put her hand on the door and felt the cold radiating through the iron and pushed it open. The wind hit her face like a verdict, and somewhere in the blood that Aldrich Vane had tried to bury, that Kylor had discarded, that the old court had never thought to look for, the Moon Dynasty opened its eyes. The wind off the ice fields did not care who she was. That was the first thing Evelina understood about the North, truly understood, in the body rather than the mind, in the weeks that followed. The wastelands did not adjust to her presence. The cold did not soften because she carried royal blood. The ice did not part because the Moon Dynasty had opened its eyes somewhere in her marrow. The North simply was what it was, and everything that lived in it had survived by learning to be harder than the thing trying to kill it, or it had not survived at all. She ran the eastern yard every morning before light, not because Riker asked her to. He had stopped making recommendations about her body after the conversation in the yard, true to his word. She ran it because the child had dropped into position 2 weeks prior, because Tessara said the birth was coming within the month, and because every morning that she completed the circuit was a morning she had not lost ground to the thing the bond severance had started inside her. The resonance was stronger now. It moved through her during the runs like a second heartbeat, irregular and deep, and she had stopped trying to analyze it and started simply letting it be there the way you let weather be there. Present, real, outside your control. Riker ran with her sometimes. Not beside her, he ran his own circuits at a pace that covered 3 times the ground in the same time, like a man burning something off rather than building something up. He never commented on her pace. He never offered assistance. When she stumbled on the uneven stone near the northeast corner on the 5th morning, he was 20 feet away and he looked, and he did not move to help her, and she caught herself and kept running. And something in the not moving was more respectful than any offered hand had ever been. The fortress had begun to feel like something that fit around her. She did not examine this too closely. It was not home. She had learned in 31 days of stone and dark what home could be stripped down to, and she was not foolish enough to mistake warmth and food and a man who did not lie to her for something as fragile and catastrophic as home. But it was functional. It was the right shape for what she needed to become. Aldrich Vane's 3,000 soldiers had reached Vorden Mar's eastern border 16 days after the general's visit. The reports came into Grimvast daily, carried by Riker's network of riders who moved through the northern wastelands with the efficiency of people who had been doing it for years, in weather that would kill anyone who had not been doing it for years. Evelina read every report. She asked questions. She pushed back on tactical assessments she found optimistic. The second week, Riker stopped having his second-in-command deliver the reports and began delivering them himself. They worked at the main table in the evenings, the maps between them, the fire at both ends of the hall, the fortress settling into its nighttime sounds around them. He was direct, and he expected directness in return, and he was not surprised when he got it. This was new to her too. The absence of having to translate herself into something more palatable, more careful, more aware of the ego she was pressing against. Kaylor had been brilliant, but brittle. Talking strategy with him had always required leaving a margin of room for his authority to feel unchallenged. Riker's authority did not need the margin. Vane isn't actually after Vorden Mar's territory, she said on the 9th evening, looking at the deployment map. The eastern push is a distraction. Look at his supply lines. They're stretched in the wrong direction for a sustained eastern campaign. He's pulling attention to the east so something can move in the north without anyone watching. Riker looked at the map, then at her. My scouts reported movement in the Drevak Pass 2 days ago. I hadn't connected it to Vane. Connect it. She put her finger on the pass. If Vane has someone inside the Northern Territories, and if that someone knows about the Moon bloodline, they know. His voice was flat. Everyone who matters know by now. The general Kaylor sent went back south and talked. She had expected this. She had expected it the moment the general walked out of Grimvast's gate. She still felt the information settle into her chest with a specific weight, the weight of a door closing on a version of events where she had more time. Then the birth needs to happen before Vane moves through the pass, she said. The birth is going to happen when it happens. He met her eyes. You don't get to schedule that. No, but I get to make sure everything else is in position before it does. She straightened up from the map. I need to speak to the clan representatives, all of them. If the Moon bloodline is the unifying authority, then they need to see it before I'm in a room recovering from childbirth and Vane is 3 days out from the northern border. Riker was quiet for a moment, calculating. She could see it. The way he ran variables, the way his eyes moved slightly without his face moving at all. That's 2 weeks of meetings, he said. Minimum. Some of these clans haven't been in the same room without fighting in 30 years. Then we have 2 weeks. Send the riders tonight. He sent the riders. The clan representatives began arriving on the 4th day. They came in ones and twos in small delegations, traveling the paths through the wastelands that only the Northborn knew, arriving at Grimvast's gate with the weather-worn faces and the watchful eyes of people who trusted nobody as a baseline, and extended that distrust in direct proportion to how much they had to lose. Evelina met each delegation in the main hall. Not on a throne, she had refused Riker's suggestion of a formal chair and sat instead at the main table. The map still spread across it because she wanted them to see a woman working rather than a woman performing. The first 3 delegations were skeptical in the polite way that meant they were waiting to see something fail before they committed to opinion. The 4th, a hard-faced elder from the Kisrath clan, whose territory controlled the northern pass approaches, was not polite about it at all. The Moon Dynasty has been dead for 200 years, the elder said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has watched many people claim many things. I've sat across from 3 pretenders in my lifetime. They all had blood tests and old techs and a man standing behind them with an army. He glanced at Riker, who was standing at the far wall with his arms crossed, not at the table, deliberately outside the conversation. And they all wanted something from us that we paid for and never got back, the elder continued. He looked at Evelina directly. What makes you different from the pretenders? I'm not asking you to believe me, she said. I'm asking you to look at what Aldrich Vane is doing to your pass approaches right now and tell me what story explains that better. A woman who invented a bloodline and somehow convinced Riker Volgrim to house her on the strength of a lie. Or a woman whose existence is enough of a threat to a very powerful man that he deployed 3,000 soldiers to the east as cover while he moves on the north. The elder looked at her for a long time. The second story, he said. Then we have something to talk about. The meetings ran long and bruising, and several of them nearly broke down entirely. Ancient grievances surfacing mid-discussion, old debts called out across the table, two delegation members who had to be physically separated on the second week when a border dispute from 12 years ago resurfaced with the specific ferocity of something that had been waiting for a room with the right people in it. Evelina managed all of it with a stillness that surprised her. Not the performed stillness of the old court, where she had learned to make herself small and careful and inoffensive. Something different, the stillness of a center point, a thing that does not move because it does not need to, because the movement happens around it, and the steadiness is the point. The resonance helped. She did not know how to explain this to Tessera or to anyone else. She was not going to try, but in the meeting rooms it moved through her like a low frequency. And when it did, the people across the table seemed to feel something they could not name, a recognition below the level of conscious thought, an animal acknowledgement that they were in the presence of something older than titles. On the 14th day, 11 of the 17 clan representatives had agreed to the preliminary framework of a Northern Alliance under the Moon Banner. On the 14th night, Evelina's water broke. Tessera was with her in under 4 minutes. Riker appeared at the door of the healer's quarters 10 minutes after that, and Tessera looked at him over Evelina's head and said, "Out! Is she out?" He went. Evelina heard his footsteps in the corridor outside, not leaving, pacing, 4 steps and back, 4 steps and back, the particular pacing of someone who commands everything in his world except the thing currently happening and cannot make himself leave the perimeter of it. The labor was long and the labor was brutal, and at several points, Tessera's face went to a careful blankness that told Evelina the numbers were not comfortable, and Evelina breathed through each wave and held the cold wall behind her and did not scream because screaming spent energy she needed for the next wave, and the next, and the one after that. The child came in the gray light before dawn. A girl, small and furious and announcing herself to the room with a sound so unambiguous in its demand for attention that Tessera actually laughed. A short, surprise sound, real and unperformed. She placed the infant in Evelina's arms, and Evelina looked at her daughter's face for the first time and felt something move through her that the resonance had not prepared her for. Something that had no strategy in it, no calculation, nothing tactical or careful or built for survival. Just the raw and total fact of her. She was alive. They were both alive. The door opened. Tessera started to object and stopped, because it was not Riker. It was his second in command, a compact, dark-haired woman named Sora who handled Grimvast's internal security, and her face was the color of bad news. "I need Volgrim," Sora said. Her eyes went to the infant and back to Evelina with the flat efficiency of someone suspending every human reaction in service of the situation. "Now, and you need to hear this too." Riker was in the room in 30 seconds. Sora did not make him wait. The Drevak Pass fell 2 hours ago. Vane's people moved faster than the scout projections. They took it with inside information. Someone told them the patrol timing. The room went very still. "Inside the fortress," Riker said. Not a question. "Inside the clan delegations," Sora's voice was clean and surgical. "Kesrath clan. The Elder's second. He's been in Vane's employ for at least 8 months. He had a message bird in his quarters. We found it when we did the sweep. The bird went out 3 days ago." 3 days ago was the day Evelina had shown the delegation the Moon Bloodline documentation that Tessera had compiled. The day she had let 11 clan representatives see the full scope of what the Northern Alliance could mean. The day she had, for the first time, shown the whole shape of the thing. The Elder's second had seen everything. He had watched her show her hand across the table in the confidence that the room was aligned, and he had taken the information and sent it south before the ink on the preliminary framework was dry. Evelina held her daughter and looked at the wall and felt the specific quality of the silence that comes after a trap closes. Not the desperate silence of the prison cells. She had been helpless there, stripped of everything. This was different. This was the silence of a woman who had done everything correctly, and had been undone not by her own failure, but by the calculation of someone who had been in the room with her, eating her food and nodding at her maps and waiting for the moment of maximum exposure. "How long before Vane can move a force from the pass to Grimvast?" she said. 3 days, Riker said. "Less if he pushes. The 6 uncommitted clans. Won't commit to anything while there's an active military threat. They'll wait to see who wins. She looked down at her daughter. 30 minutes old. The fortress around them was already beginning its shift into war configuration. She could hear it, the change in the sound of the building, the movement in the corridors, the specific frequency of urgency that had replaced the ordinary evening sounds. The elder, she said. The Kesrath elder himself. Does he know what his second did? Unknown, Sora said. Find out. Because if he didn't know, he's humiliated and terrified, and that makes him a resource. And if he did know, she stopped. Let the end of the sentence carry its own weight without finishing it. Sora looked at Riker. He gave a short nod. She left. Riker looked at Evelina. She looked back. She watched him assess the situation, the infant, the 3-day window, the pass, the 6 uncommitted clans, the traitor who had walked out of Grimvast with the intelligence that would tell Vane exactly what force he needed and where to direct it. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. Not a command. The voice of a man who has learned that this particular mind in this particular state is worth listening to before acting. Vane doesn't want to kill me, she said. He wants the bloodline. Dead. I'm a martyr and the Alliance holds. Alive and captive, I'm leverage and the Alliance fractures. She looked at the infant. He wants her too. The second generation of the Moon bloodline, raised under his authority. That's the play. Riker's jaw tightened. He's not getting near her. No, he's not. She shifted her daughter's weight in her arms and felt the resonance move through her blood, deeper than it had ever moved, stronger. The crack the bond severance had made now blown fully open by the thing that had just happened in this room, the most ancient and ungovernable opening a body can make. Bring me the clan elder. Not tomorrow. Now. You just gave birth. I know what I just did. She met his eyes. Bring me the elder. Something moved across Riker's face. It was there and gone in less than a second, but she caught it. The same thing she had seen in the training yard weeks ago. Not admiration exactly. The specific recognition of someone watching a thing become fully itself. He brought her the elder. The old man from the Kesrath clan arrived at the healer's quarters looking like a man who had aged 10 years in an hour. He stood in the doorway and looked at Evelina sitting upright against the wall with her daughter in her arms, and whatever he had prepared to say died before it reached his mouth. Your second sent a bird to Vane 3 days ago, Evelina said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Vane now controls the Drevik Pass and has a 3-day march to this fortress. I need to know if you knew. The elder's face worked through several expressions. She watched them and read them and waited. I didn't know, he said finally. His voice was rough, cracked in the specific way of an old man genuinely shocked. I swear to you on... Don't swear on anything. I don't need oaths. I need to know what your clan brings to a fight that starts in 3 days. He stared at her. The pass is gone, she said. Vane has it. The 6 uncommitted clans are watching to see which way to fall. Your second tried to end this before it started, and he failed because I'm still here and the Alliance is still standing, and Vane is 3 days out instead of already at the gate. She held the elder's gaze. So tell me, what does Kesrath bring? Silence. The fire. The infant making a small sound in the crook of her arm. The elder straightened, not the straightening of a man performing dignity, the straightening of an old man who had spent his entire life making decisions and recognized the moment when one more decision was going to define everything that came before it. 400 trained fighters, he said, and the loyalty of 2 of the 6 uncommitted clans who follow Kesrath's word when Kesrath's word is clear. Then make your word clear, tonight. She looked at him until he nodded. Then she looked at Riker. And get me a sword. Tessara's voice came from the corner of the room where she had been standing in silence since the elder arrived. You are 12 hours postpartum. I know. Evelina looked at her daughter's face, the closed eyes, the furious perfect aliveness of her. And in 3 days something is coming for her. So get me a sword and tell me what my body can do, and I'll decide what I ask it to do. That's the arrangement. Tessara looked at her for a long moment with those stormwater eyes. Then she said, You can stand for 6 hours before the muscle fatigue becomes a liability. You cannot run. You can ride if the terrain is flat. And if you ask me to lie to you about any of those limits, I will walk out of this fortress and you will manage on your own. I would never ask you to lie. Evelina looked at the elder. "We have 3 days. Go make your word clear." He went. The fortress moved through the night like a body preparing for impact, every part of it finding its function, the noise and the light, and the cold air carrying the smell of weapon oil and horses, and the particular human smell of people who had decided something and were now living inside that decision. Evelina sat in the healer's quarters with her daughter, and listened to it and let the resonance move through her blood, and felt, for the first time since the Great Hall of Vordenmar, something she recognized distantly as alignment. The sensation of being exactly the thing that the moment required, no more and no less, without the translation, without the margin of room left for someone else's brittle authority. The crack the bond severance had made, the crack the birth had blown open, the resonance moving through it like a tide finding level. She was not the woman who had stood in Vordenmar's throne room with her hands folded at her waist. She was not the Luna who had learned to make herself invisible in her own composure. She was not the prisoner in the lower cells counting the intervals between movements in the dark. She did not have a name yet for what she was becoming, but in 3 days, Aldrich Vane was going to find out. The sword Riker gave her was not ceremonial. It was a working blade, single-edged northern steel, the handle worn smooth by years of actual use rather than display. When he placed it on the table in front of her, he said nothing. She picked it up, tested the balance, set it down. Her arm trembled slightly on the extension. She noted the tremor, filed it, did not acknowledge it aloud. Tassara, from across the room, said nothing either. They had an agreement. The 3 days moved the way the days before a storm move, with the particular compressed quality of time that knows what's coming and cannot do anything but run toward it. Evelina slept in 4-hour intervals and spent the waking hours between feeding her daughter and sitting at the war table with Riker and Sora, moving pieces across the maps with the specific cold focus of someone who understands that the distance between a plan and a catastrophe is usually one assumption that turned out to be wrong. The Kesroth elder delivered. 12 hours after their conversation in the healer's quarters, riders went out from his camp to the 2 uncommitted clans whose loyalty he had claimed, and by the following evening both had sent delegates to Grimvast with the same message. Show us the moon, and we stand. Not a political commitment, not an alliance framework, a direct animal demand for confirmation of the thing they had been told existed. She showed them. She stood at the far end of the main hall in the firelight, with her daughter in her arms, and let the resonance move through her without managing it, without containing it, without translating it into something more palatable or more political. And what happened in the room was not something she could have orchestrated. The delegates felt it the way animals feel a change in air pressure, a collective stillness, a physical adjustment, the specific recognition of something older than any of their titles or territories pressing against the air and being undeniable. Both clans committed before midnight, 13 of 17. Riker told her this was enough. She told him enough was not the same as everything, and he looked at her with those level eyes and said, "No, it's not, but it's what we have, and we work with what we have." She slept 4 hours and woke to the sound of scouts returning. Vane was not 3 days out. He was 36 hours out and moving faster than the projections, which meant either better horses or better intelligence about the timeline at Grimvast, which meant either the trader's information had included the birth or someone else was still feeding him details. The second possibility settled into the war table like a stone dropped into standing water. Sora ran the fortress security sweep herself. She did it methodically and without announcement, and she did it while Evelina sat at the table and watched Riker work through the defensive deployment and tried to locate the feeling she had about the breach, the specific texture of it, the direction it was coming from, the thing she had been circling for 2 days without being able to name. "It's not a second source," she said. Riker looked up from the map. "The timing is wrong for a second source. The Kesrath second sent the bird 3 days ago. That information would have given Vane the bloodline documentation and the clan alignment status as of 3 days ago. What it wouldn't have given him is the birth." She looked at the deployment map. He's moving faster because of the birth. He knows it happened. The bird could have carried... The bird went out before the birth. He knows because someone told him in real time. She looked up. Not a message bird. Something faster. Something that doesn't require a bird to reach him. Sora appeared in the doorway. Her face said she had found it. The runner was 17 years old. One of the stable hands. A boy who had been at Grimvast for 2 years, unremarkable in every way that mattered to security screening, which was exactly why he had been chosen. He had not been recruited by Vane directly. He had been recruited by a merchant in the Northern Trade Network who had been recruited by someone else. A chain of remove and deniability so long that the boy probably did not know whose cause he was actually serving. He had sent signals by lantern through the outer wall's northeast gap on 3 consecutive nights. The signals had been received by a rider in the tree line who had covered the distance to Vane's forward position in under 12 hours each time. Sora had him in the inner yard. Evelina walked out there herself, 12 hours postpartum, sword at her hip, the cold hitting her face like a flat palm. The boy was on his knees in the snow. He was crying, not dramatically, just the quiet, continuous leak of someone who has been caught doing something they knew was wrong and cannot explain to themselves anymore why they did it, except that they were 17 and someone had offered them money and safety, and the North in winter is a very hard place to be poor and young and without protection. She stood in front of him and felt absolutely nothing about his youth or his tears. This was new. Or not new, present in a way it had not been before the prison and the birth and the 3 days of understanding exactly what was coming for her daughter. The capacity for ruthlessness had always been in her. She had simply never been in a situation that required her to stop apologizing for it. "What did you tell him last night?" she said. The boy told her. His voice shook, but it was coherent. The location of the main defensive line, the deployment of Riker's Northern Cavalry, the number of clan fighters and their staging positions, everything he had seen through the gaps in walls and overheard in corridors while being perfectly invisible as a stable boy, which was to say almost everything. Sora looked at Riker. "Change the deployment," Evelina said. "Everything he described, change it. Full repositioning in the next 4 hours." Riker nodded at Sora. She moved. Evelina looked down at the boy. He looked back at her through his tears with the face of someone waiting for something final. "Get up," she said. "You're going to be very useful in the next 36 hours. He blinked. "What?" "You're going to send one more signal tonight, exactly the kind he'd expect, and you're going to tell Vane's rider exactly what I tell you to tell him." She held his gaze without softness, without cruelty, without anything except the flat certainty of a woman who has decided. "After that, you're going to spend the next 6 months doing whatever Sora tells you to do to pay off what you owe this fortress. And if you decide somewhere in those 6 months that you'd rather run, she'll find you in a day. Do you understand that?" He nodded, wiping his face on his sleeve. "Say it." "I understand." "Good. Get up." He got up. The false information went out that night. A carefully constructed picture of a defensive line pulled back toward the fortress's main gate. The Northern Cavalry positioned on the western approach. The clan fighters deployed along the outer wall in a configuration that looked like maximum strength and was actually maximum exposure. A formation that told Vane's tactical mind, they are concentrating their defense here. Come here. And he would come, because his intelligence had been reliable for 3 days, and there was no reason to doubt it now, and because a man who has bought information for long enough starts to trust the purchase more than his own instincts. Riker gave the repositioning orders with the compressed efficiency of a man who had done this before, moved a fighting force in the dark, in cold, in silence, without lights that could be seen from the tree line. He did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself. Each order went out and came back confirmed, and the fortress shifted itself in the dark like something vast and alive rearranging its weight. Evelina watched from the inner wall and held the resonance in her blood like a drawn breath. At some point, Riker appeared beside her. He stood at the wall and looked out at the darkness and said, "You should be inside." "Probably. Tessara's going to have words with me." "Tessara has words with everyone. It's her primary weapon." She kept her eyes on the tree line. "Where are you putting the reserves?" "East Ridge, out of visual range until the line commits." He paused. "You worked that out 2 days ago." "I worked out where I would put them 2 days ago. I wanted to know if we were thinking the same way." "Were we?" "Close enough." She turned from the wall. "Where's my daughter?" "With Tessara, inner chambers. Sora has 3 people on the door." She nodded. The cold moved through her, and the resonance moved through the cold, and she stood for one moment in the dark of the inner wall and let herself feel the full weight of what was coming. Not to prepare for it, not to manage it, but simply to know it completely. the size of it, the irreversibility of it. 36 hours from now or less, Aldrich Vane was going to arrive with everything he had, and either she was going to be standing when it was done, or she was not, and her daughter was going to grow up knowing who she was, or she was not, and the Moon Dynasty was going to mean something in the living world again, or it was going to go back into the old texts where it had been buried for 230 years. The weight of it was enormous. She picked it up, turned back toward the inner fortress, kept moving. Vane's force appeared at the northern tree line 4 hours before dawn on the second day, earlier than projected by 6 hours, which meant he had pushed through the night with torches dark, covering ground on pace and memory rather than sight. A disciplined force, an expensive one, the kind of fighting unit that cost real money and took real years to build, and the fact that Vane was willing to spend it here, on this, told her everything she needed to know about how seriously he took the threat she represented. She was standing on the outer wall when the scout's signal came in. Sora materialized at her left shoulder, Riker at her right, already armored, already present in the way he was present before a fight, absolutely still and absolutely alert, like a landscape before a lightning strike. "He's not coming to the gate," Sora said, reading the signal. "No." Riker's voice was quiet. "He's splitting, 60% to the main approach, 40% to the eastern ridge." Evelina felt the cold drop through her chest. "He knows. He suspects. The signal last night wasn't enough." "He suspects," she said again, "which means he's hedging. He's sending enough to the east to deal with what might be there, and enough to the main approach to break through what he thinks is there." She looked at Riker. "The Eastern Cavalry. We'll hold if the terrain advantage. We'll hold or won't hold, but either way, if the main approach breaks through before the east is resolved, they're inside the wall." She looked at the deployment map in her head and ran the variables and felt the specific quality of a plan that had just developed a load-bearing crack. "You need to be at the eastern ridge." Riker turned to look at her directly. In the darkness and the cold, his face was all hard edges and absolute attention. "That puts you at the main approach. With the clan fighters and your wall garrison, yes? You are 38 hours postpartum. I know the number." "Evelina." He said her name the way he said everything, directly, without performance, just the word itself carrying the full weight of what he meant. "Tell me you're not planning to be on the main approach line." She looked at him. The resonance moved through her blood like a tide that had stopped asking permission. "I'm planning to be where they can see me," she said. "That's what the clan fighters came for. That's what the 6 uncommitted clans are waiting to see before they move. If the moon banner is behind a wall somewhere safe while the fighting happens, this alliance is a political arrangement, and it holds as long as the politics hold." She held his gaze. "But if it's on the wall, in the dark, in the cold, at the main approach when Vane's force hits, it's something else. Something that doesn't need politics to hold it." He was silent for a long time. "You could die," he said. The directness of it, the absence of decoration, was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. "I could have died in the prison," she said. "I could have died in the snow when your horse found me in the dark. I could have died 12 times in the last 3 months, and none of them were moments I had warning enough to be careful." She did not look away from him. "This one I have warning for. That's better odds than I've had all winter." Something moved across his face. It was there and gone the way everything moved across his face. Fast, deep, real. He reached out and put his hand on the side of her head, very briefly, just the weight of it, just the fact of it, and then he pulled it back and turned toward the eastern wall and began moving. "Don't take the sword arm," he called back without turning. "You can't block left-handed with those muscles this soon. Stay center mass. Let the garrison take the forward line." She looked at his back as he walked away from her in the dark and felt something she was not going to examine in the middle of a night before a battle. "Sora," she said. "Already moving," Sora said, and she was. The main approach filled with the controlled chaos of a force deploying in darkness and cold. The Kesrith fighters moving to their positions, the 2 newly committed clans flanking left and right, Grimvast's garrison taking the forward line as Riker had said, and in the center of all of it, on the raised section of the outer wall where the clan fighters could see her and the approach below was clear, Evelina stood with the northern steel sword in her right hand and let the resonance move through her until it was in her breath, in her blood, in the specific quality of stillness she carried in her body that the people around her could feel without being able to name. The Kesrath elder was beside her. He had come to the wall without being asked. He looked older in the dark and colder. A man who had made the decision of his life 2 days ago and was now standing in the physical location that decision had led him to. And whatever he felt about that, he was still standing. "You don't have to be here," she said. "My second betrayed this alliance," he said. I'm here." She nodded. That was enough. Vane's main force came out of the tree line with torches lit, which was arrogance or provocation, or both. They moved in tight formation, professional, expensive, the controlled movement of soldiers who trusted their strength enough to announce it. At their center, visible in the torch line, a figure on a gray horse in Eastern court armor, overseeing the approach from behind the front line. Aldrich Vane. Not in the back, not at a command post a safe distance from the wall. Present, visible, watching. He wanted to see her. She understood this with cold clarity. He had built this entire operation around a bloodline he had identified and tried to bury, and some part of him, the part that had commissioned the genealogy report and then suppressed it, the part that had spent 7 years running Soraya from behind a curtain. Some part of him needed to see the thing he had failed to destroy before he tried again. She raised the sword, not a gesture, not a signal to the fighters around her, just the blade going up and the resonance moving through her arm into the steel and the specific quality of light that the moon bloodline cast. Not brightness, not fire, but the deep cold luminescence that the old texts described, and that Tessara had documented, and that she herself had not fully believed until this moment when it came out of her without asking. The fighters on the wall went absolutely still. Below, in the front line of Vane's advancing force, she saw the forward soldiers slow. Not stop. Slow. The specific slowing of people whose bodies have registered something their tactical training has not prepared them for. The gray horse danced beneath Vane. He controlled it with one hand and stared up at the wall. At her. The Kesrath elder made a sound beside her, low, involuntary, the sound of a man watching something he had doubted for 60 years become undeniably, physically real. The uncommitted clans. She had known they were watching. She had planned for them to be watching. 2 of them had scouts positioned at the tree line on the northern approach, just outside the engagement zone, close enough to see the wall clearly. That was why she was here. That was the calculation. That was what she had told Riker. The moon banner on the wall, visible, undeniable, in the dark and the cold. But the scouts who had positioned themselves to observe were not the only ones watching. From the south, from the direction of the Vorden-Mar Road, from the direction she had deliberately not looked at for 3 months because there was nothing there that she needed. From the south came the sound of a single horse moving at a walk, and then stopping. Sora's voice, tight and quiet, right at her shoulder. "Luna." She did not look. "Evelina." The voice carried even over the wind, even over the sound of Vane's force 40 feet below the wall. Deep and familiar and carrying in it the specific frequency of a man who had been walking for days and sleeping for none of them, and had arrived in this place prepared to face whatever waited for him here. Kaylor's voice. She looked. He was at the southern gate approach, alone, on a horse that looked like it had been ridden hard for 72 hours without care. He was not in armor. No iron crown. He looked like a man who had stripped himself of everything that announced what he was, which was either the most calculated move possible or the most genuinely broken one. And she could not tell from this distance which it was, and she was not going to let herself need to know. Below the main wall, Vane's force had stopped advancing, not in response to Kaylor, in response to the light coming off the moon sword, still raised, still casting that deep cold luminescence over the wall and the fighters and the dark. Vane on the gray horse was looking between her and the southern gate with the expression of a man watching a tactical situation change shape in real time. Every variable in the night had just shifted simultaneously. Vane's force at the main approach, paused and uncertain. Riker on the eastern ridge, engaged or about to be. Kaylor at the southern gate, stripped of his armor and his crown and everything that had made him terrifying and terrible in hers. The uncommitted clans watching the wall, the moon sword raised. Her daughter in the inner chambers with Tessara and 3 of Sora's people on the door. And Evelina at the center of all of it, the point around which every force in the night was currently oriented, feeling the resonance in her blood and the sword in her hand, and the specific terrible clarity of a woman who has been pushed into the exact shape that the moment requires and now has to decide if she is going to be it, fully and finally, and without the margin of room she had been holding back. Below her, Aldrich Vane raised his hand. His force resumed its advance. Aldrich Vane raised his hand and his force moved, and Evelina made the only decision that was left to make. She did not look south again. Kaylor was at the gate, and Kaylor was not the problem that was going to kill her daughter tonight. And whatever he represented, the grief of it, the history of it, the specific weight of a man who had destroyed something and then walked barefoot through the wreckage to find her, none of it was the work right now. She filed him the way she had filed everything that was not immediately survivable, and she turned back to the approach and she let the resonance move through her arm and into the sword, and she said one word to the Kesrath elder beside her. Now! He raised the clan horn and blew it. The eastern ridge answered first, the sound of Riker's cavalry coming over the ridgeline at full run, hitting the flank of Vane's eastern force before they had finished deploying, the ground thunder of it reaching the main wall half a second before the collision itself. Then the uncommitted clans moved, both of them, from the tree-line positions where their scouts had been watching, not scouts at all, but forward fighters who had been waiting to see the moonsword raised and had seen it, and were now fully committed and coming in from the north at an angle that cut Vane's main force in two. 13 clans, not a political arrangement, something older. The main approach broke into close fighting inside of 4 minutes. Evelina stayed on the wall. This was the hardest thing, not the fear, not the pain still living in her body from the birth, not the cold that had worked through her armor and settled into her bones. The hardest thing was staying where she was useful and not moving to where she felt necessary. She was not a frontline fighter tonight. She was a fixed point, a visible thing, the eye of the storm around which everything else was orienting, and moving from that position to satisfy the animal instinct to be in the middle of the fight would cost more than it spent. She held the sword up and let the light come out of her and watched. Vane's force was professional and it was well-equipped, and in a straight engagement on open ground it would have destroyed anything the North clans brought. But Vane had planned for a fortress defense, a static line, a gate to breach, walls to overcome. He had not planned for a multi-vector engagement that came at him from 3 directions simultaneously, while his intelligence about the defensive deployment turned out to be completely wrong. The forward line fractured at the 20-minute mark. At 30 minutes, the eastern force was broken, and Riker was coming over the outer wall with half his cavalry, cutting toward the center of the main approach from behind. At 35 minutes, Aldrich Vane turned the gray horse. He did not run. She gave him that. He turned the horse deliberately, with the controlled movement of a man making a tactical decision rather than a panicked one, and he began moving toward the southern approach where the fighting was thinnest, where the gap in the engagement lines was widest, where the southern gate was, where Kaylor was. She was moving before she decided to move, down from the raised wall section, through the garrison fighters pulling back from the forward line, past the Kesrath elder who called her name and got no answer. Her legs held. The muscle fatigue that Tessara had warned her about was present, and she ran through it the way you run through water, with the understanding that it was slowing her but not stopping her, and stopping was not a choice tonight. She came through the inner gate and into the southern approach yard at a run and stopped. Kaylor had Vane's gray horse by the bridle. He had come off his own horse. The exhausted animal was standing 20 feet away, head low, and he was on foot, holding Vane's horse with one hand and looking up at the man on it with the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision so complete that there is nothing left in the body but the execution of it. He was not in armor. He had no weapon she could see. He had stopped a mounted, armored man through some combination of physical placement and the specific quality of presence that very large, very dangerous people carry in their bodies like a low-frequency broadcast. Vane looked down at him. Then his eyes moved to Evelina arriving in the yard, sword still in hand, the moonlight still coming off the blade. The expression on Vane's face was the expression of a man watching the conclusion of a story he had written and had not expected to end this way. "Chancellor," she said. She was breathing hard. She stopped 10 feet from the horse and held his gaze. "Get down!" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Kaylor's hand on the bridle, then back at her. He got down. The fighting in the main approach was already thinning. She could hear it in the sound. The shift from full engagement to pursuit and surrender, the specific acoustic signature of a battle that has found its outcome and is working through the final stages. Riker's voice somewhere in the dark, giving orders in the clipped cadences of a man managing the aftermath. Sora's people moving through the southern yard, arriving one by one and taking positions around Vane with the efficiency of people who had been told exactly what to do if this moment arrived. Vane stood in the yard without his horse, without his force, without the 7 years of planning and money and manipulation that had brought him to this wall, and he looked at Evelina the way people look at things they tried to erase when the things turn out to be indestructible. "The genealogy report," she said. He said nothing. "You found it 6 years ago. You suppressed it. You found me 3 years later when I became Kaelor's Luna, and you decided that a moon bloodline carrier bonded to a Vordenmar heir was a combination you couldn't afford to let survive." She kept her voice flat, not because she felt flat. She felt many things, enormous things, the weight of everything the last 3 months had cost her pressing against the inside of her chest. But because the flatness was the language that kept her standing upright, and she needed to be upright for this. "And you built a woman into a weapon and aimed her at me and waited." "Soraya was not built," Vane said. His voice was calm, almost clinical, the voice of a man who had already separated himself from the outcome and was observing from a distance. "She had her own ambitions. I gave her a direction. You gave her my death. I gave her a path to what she wanted. What she did with it. Don't." The word came out with an edge that surprised even her. "Don't give me the distance. You knew what she was going to do. You knew what Kaelor would do when she did it. You knew about the bond severance and the pregnancy risk, and you didn't care because a dead Luna was acceptable collateral damage for eliminating the moon bloodline." She looked at him. "You've been running a war on a bloodline for 6 years. Own it." A long silence, the last sounds of fighting dying in the main approach. The cold. The specific stillness of a yard that had just become the end of something large. Vane looked at her. The clinical distance in his face cracked slightly. Not regret, not guilt, something more complicated than either. The look of a man who had believed completely in the correctness of his own calculus and was standing in the physical evidence that the calculus had been wrong. "You were a genealogy entry," he said. "You were a record in an archive that should have stayed closed. Whatever you've become." He looked at the sword, the light still coming off it, faint now as the urgency drained from her body. "That wasn't in the projection." "No," she said. "It wasn't." She looked at Sora. "Take him." Sora took him. She stood in the yard after they walked him through the inner gate and let her sword arm drop for the first time in 2 hours. The trembling that started was not fear. It was the body calling in the debt of everything she had asked of it, and she paid it by standing still and breathing until it passed. Behind her, 20 feet away, Kaelor had not moved. She had known he was there. She had been knowing he was there since the sound of his voice on the southern approach had cut through everything else in the night. She had filed him and done the work that needed doing, and now the work was done, and the filing was over, and there was nothing left to stand between her and the fact of him standing in the dark, 20 feet behind her, like a man who had walked to the edge of something and was waiting to find out if the edge held. She turned around. He looked destroyed. That was the only word for it. Not physically. He was intact, the big body still carrying itself with the instinctive authority of a man built for command. But the face was destroyed. The thing she had seen in the throne room, that cold, judicial, already decided stillness, was completely gone, and what was under it was worse to look at because it was real. It was the face of a man who had lived for 3 months inside the full understanding of what he had done, without the mercy of time or distance making it smaller. He had aged a decade in a season. "She's dead," he said. Not Soraya's name, just the fact. "I heard. 3 days after I—" He stopped. His jaw worked. 3 days after I executed her people and opened the archive and read the suppressed report and understood everything she had done, everything she had been doing from the beginning, Vane's people put an arrow in her from a moving cart in the capital street. He looked at Evelina with the specific bitterness of a man who had been used completely and had to watch the people who used him tie off the loose ends from a comfortable distance. She was expendable to him the moment she stopped being useful. She was always expendable. She made choices, Evelina said. Yes. So did you. Yes. The word landed in the yard like something being set down after being carried too long. Yes, I did. She looked at him and felt the vast complexity of what she carried about him. 3 years of love and war, and the specific intimacy of standing beside someone through things that bond you and break you simultaneously. The prison. The bond severance. Her daughter's heartbeat against her palm in the dark. The 31 days of cold that had done their best to finish what his choices had started. She felt all of it, and she let it be there without managing it and without using it as a weapon. The child, he said. His voice changed on the word, lower, rougher, carrying the specific weight of a man trying to ask about something he has forfeited the right to ask about but cannot stop himself from asking. Is she? She's alive, Evelina said. She's healthy. She's inside. Something moved across his face that she had not seen there in 3 years, raw and unguarded and enormous. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, the destruction in his face had deepened rather than eased, because some griefs get worse when they're confirmed as real rather than feared as possible. What's her name? He said. Evelina was quiet for a long time. The cold moved through the yard. Somewhere in the fortress, her daughter was in Tessara's arms in the firelight and did not know any of this was happening, which was exactly as it should be. I haven't named her yet, she said. That's mine to do. Not a court ceremony, not a bloodline rite. Mine. He nodded. He understood. She could see that he understood, which was the thing about Kaylor that had always been most difficult to locate simple anger toward. He was not stupid, had never been stupid. His failures had been failures of choice rather than comprehension, which was in some ways worse and in some ways more survivable. I'm not here to ask for anything, he said. I know. She looked at him. Why are you here, Kaylor? He looked back at her for a long time. The wind moved between them. I needed you to know that I know, he said. Not to fix it, not to ask you to. I know there's nothing to fix. I needed you to know that I understand what I did, the whole shape of it, not just the mistake of believing Soraya. The years before that, the way I trained myself to choose the expedient explanation over the difficult truth every time they were in the same room. Soraya didn't make me that way. She just found what was already there and used it. She had not expected this. She had expected pleading or justification or the particular performance of a powerful man demonstrating his willingness to humble himself in a way that was still, underneath, a bid for restoration. She had been braced for that. She was not braced for the flat, unperformed accounting of a man who had done the work of looking at himself clearly and had not liked what he found and was not dressing it up. The honesty of it was harder to stand in front of than the performance would have been. Go home, she said. He blinked. Go home, Kaylor. Your kingdom is in rebellion, and your eastern border has a power vacuum that 3 different parties are going to try to fill before the month is out, and you have work to do. She held his gaze. That's not cruelty. That's just what's true. The work is what's left when everything else is gone, and the work doesn't care about the grief. He stood in the yard and looked at her. Looked at her with the full weight of everything he had lost, and everything he had destroyed, and everything he would carry for the rest of his life. And then he did something she did not expect. He nodded. Not a bow, not a submission, not the gesture of a man acknowledging defeat. The nod of someone receiving a piece of information they needed and accepting its accuracy. The girl, he said. One more time, his voice very quiet. She'll know her history, Evelina said, all of it, when she's old enough to carry it. A pause. That's all I can give you. He nodded again. He walked to his exhausted horse and gathered the reins and looked at the animal for a moment with something that might have been the beginning of care for something outside himself, which was more than she had expected to see in him tonight. Then he mounted and he rode south without looking back. She watched him go until the dark took him. Riker found her in the southern yard 10 minutes later. He was bloodied along one side, not badly, a graze from something fast and close on the eastern ridge. And he was already past the fight, the way he was always past the fight, the battle focus draining out of him and leaving behind the same level, direct, unhurried man who had materialized out of the snowfield 3 months ago and said 4 words that she had been unpacking ever since. He looked at the direction Kaylor had gone, then at her. You let him leave, he said. He came to say something. He said it. There was nothing else to hold him for. Riker was quiet for a moment. Was it enough? Whatever he said. She thought about this seriously, the way she had learned to think about serious things. Without rushing to the answer, without performing either hardness or softness, just letting the question sit until it showed her its actual shape. No, she said. It wasn't enough. It was just true. Those aren't the same thing. She turned toward the inner fortress. But true was more than I expected. He walked beside her through the inner gate and into the warmth of the fortress corridor, and neither of them spoke, which was one of the things she had learned about him in 3 months. The silences were not empty. They were a different kind of conversation, the kind that did not need words because both people were already present in the same understanding. Tessara met them in the corridor outside the inner chambers. She looked at the blood on Riker's side, and then at Evelina with those stormwater eyes that had catalogued everything from the beginning and never once flinched from what they saw. The child is fine, she said. She's been asleep for 2 hours. Whatever you carry in your blood, she seems to have inherited the stubbornness. Evelina made a sound, not quite a laugh. Something real and brief and involuntary. The kind of sound that only comes out when the body decides to release something the mind would have chosen to hold. She went through the door. Her daughter was in the wooden cradle that one of Riker's carpenters had built 4 days before the birth. Without being asked, which was something she had thought about since the way this fortress produced care in the form of practical action rather than language. The way people here expressed what mattered to them by building things and fixing things and positioning themselves quietly between danger and the people they had decided to protect. She stood over the cradle and looked at her daughter's face. The closed eyes. The small, furious breathing of a child who was thoroughly asleep and had no concerns about battles or chancellors or the weight of ancient bloodlines. Just the animal fact of being new and alive and entirely unaware that the world had just reorganized itself around the question of whether she would be permitted to remain in it. She picked her up very carefully so as not to wake her, and sat down with her against the wall where the fire was warmest and held her and felt the resonance. Quieter now, sated, the tide that had been pressing outward for weeks settling back into its deep channel. She thought about what Kaylor had said in the yard, the whole shape of it, the acknowledgement of a pattern that had preceded Soraya, and would have eventually found some other instrument even without her. The habit of choosing expedience over truth, the small daily erosions of trust that happen so gradually that you don't see the structural damage until the floor gives way. She thought about what it had taken to see that in yourself, the particular courage of it, not the courage of standing on a wall in the dark with a sword, which she had done tonight, which was the kind of courage that ran on adrenaline and necessity. The other kind, the kind that required you to stop moving and stop managing and stop performing and look at yourself in the cold light of what you had actually done and not look away. She had not forgiven him. She was not going to reach for that word tonight or force the feeling it was supposed to contain. Forgiveness was not a decision you made once. It was a direction you started walking, and whether you arrived depended on how many miles were actually between you and the destination. And she did not know the distance yet, and she was not going to lie to herself about it. What she knew was that she was here, that her daughter was breathing steadily in her arms, that the North was intact and the Alliance was holding, and Aldrich Vane was in grim vast holding cells waiting for the kind of justice that came with witnesses and records, rather than the quick erasure he had tried to apply to her. That Tessara was in the outer room drinking something hot and being cared for by people who had learned in 3 months that the old healer would not ask for what she needed and had to be handed it. That Riker was in the corridor outside the door. She knew this without hearing him. She simply knew, the way she knew weather now, the way she knew the pass approaches and the clan territories and the direction of the ice-field wind, as information her blood carried without requiring her to think about it. She got up and went to the door and opened it. He was standing with his back against the opposite wall, arms crossed, not pacing, just present. He looked at her and at the child in her arms, and the expression on his face was the one she still did not have a full name for. Not warmth, not strategy, not the calculation of a man managing an alliance. Something underneath all of those. Something that had been there since the snowfield and had been patient enough to wait while she survived everything she needed to survive to arrive at this corridor at this hour with her daughter in her arms and the battle behind her and the morning somewhere ahead. She needs a name, Evelina said. She does. I've been thinking about Sarah. She held his gaze. Sarah, shortened. Something moved across his face. He looked at the child, then at Evelina. Sarah Volgrim, he said, quietly, testing the shape of it, not claiming, asking. The corridor was very still. That's a conversation, she said. Not tonight, but it's a conversation. I'm not going anywhere. No. She looked at him for a long time. This man who had met her in a snowfield and given her a sword and space and the specific rare gift of being expected to be exactly as competent and complicated as she actually was, who had not tried to own what she was becoming, who had stood at the eastern ridge tonight in the blood and the dark because she had told him to and trusted her enough to go. Neither am I. She went back inside. She sat down by the fire with Sarah against her chest. She listened to the fortress settling into its post-battle silence, the sounds of aftermath, the particular exhausted quiet of people who had done what they came to do and were now finding their way back to ordinary life, which was itself a form of triumph, the most unglamorous and necessary kind. The fire burned down. She did not sleep. Not yet. Not quite. She sat in the warmth with her daughter and let the night do what nights do after enormous things, which is to gradually become ordinary again, to lose the charged quality of crisis and become simply dark and quiet and temporary. She thought about the woman in the throne room of Vorden Mar, hands folded, back straight, invisible in her composure, carrying a child in a silence and the careful performance of someone who had learned to survive by making herself the right shape for the space she was permitted to occupy. She could not locate that woman inside herself anymore. Not because the prison had destroyed her, or the bond severance had destroyed her, or the winter had destroyed her. Because she had been, incrementally and irreversibly, replaced. Not by someone harder or colder or more ruthless, by someone more complete. Someone who had learned the difference between being still because you have made yourself small and being still because you are the center point around which things move, and had discovered in the terrible laboratory of the last 3 months that she was the second kind, had always been the second kind, had simply been in rooms that required her to pretend to be the first. The Moon Dynasty. The ancient blood. The resonance that had woken in her because everything that was supposed to kill it had instead cracked the door open wider. She did not think of it as destiny. Destiny was a word that erased the cost, and the cost had been enormous and real and paid in specific daily denominations of suffering and survival that no bloodline mythology could romanticize. She thought of it as what remained. After Kalor's choice and Soraya's ambition and Vane's cold calculation and 31 days of darkness and a child born in the middle of a war she had not started, this was what remained. This woman, in this room, with this child. She had not been built by the things that tried to break her. She had been revealed by them. The difference mattered. Outside the window, the sky was changing. The specific deep gray that came before the northern dawn. The light that did not arrive dramatically but simply accumulated until the dark was no longer the dominant fact of the world. Sarah made a sound in her sleep, small and definitive and entirely her own. Evelina held her tighter, not tight enough to wake her. Just the pressure of a woman who had learned that the things worth holding required both hands and no apology. The dawn came. She let it.